June 1943. The transport ship rolled through Atlantic swells, its hold packed with 300 German prisoners bound for a country they had been taught to despise. Below deck, 20-year-old Klaus Becker gripped the rail and waited for the America of propaganda-bombed cities, starving civilians, a nation collapsing under the weight of war. Instead, when the harbor came into view, he saw something that would shatter everything he believed. The skyline rose impossibly tall and undamaged against the morning sky, and someone whispered what they were all thinking. This cannot be real. The journey had begun in North Africa. Klaus Becker, formerly of the 10th Panzer Division, had surrendered near Tunis in May 1943, along with nearly 250,000 other German and Italian forces. The Afrika Korps, once considered elite, invincible, had simply run out of everything. Fuel, ammunition, hope. When British and American forces closed the trap, resistance became pointless mathematics. Klaus had thrown down his rifle and raised his hands along with 30 men from his company, all of them gaunt and exhausted, their uniforms stiff with salt and sand. The holding camps in North Africa were temporary, crowded, chaotic. Thousands of prisoners crammed into hastily constructed compounds under canvas tents that magnified the desert heat. Water came in irregular intervals. Food consisted of hard biscuits and thin soup. Dysentery moved through the camps like wildfire. Men died not from violence, but from exhaustion, disease, the body's simple surrender after months of brutal combat. Klaus survived by becoming invisible. He kept his head down, followed orders, avoided the hardcore officers who still believed victory was possible. At night, lying on the ground with a blanket that did little against the desert cold, he thought about home. His father's farm outside Wurzburg. His mother's kitchen, always warm with bread baking. His younger sister, 14 now, who had cried when he left for the war. They felt impossibly distant, separated not just by miles, but by the fundamental transformation that combat had wrought on his soul. In early June, word spread through the camp. Transport to America. The announcement created immediate division. Some prisoners celebrated America, meant distance from combat, from bombing raids, from the war's grinding machinery. Others reacted with dread, believing the stories they had been told. America was weak. They had learned. America was decadent, on the verge of collapse, its cities burning, its people starving. Prisoners sent there would face mobs, lynchings, revenge for every German victory. Klaus didn't know what to believe. He was 20 years old and had already seen propaganda dissolve into reality too many times. The regime had promised quick victory in Poland achieved, yes, but at costs not mentioned. They had promised France would fall it had, but the fighting had been fiercer than expected. They had promised the desert would be theirs, and here he sat, a prisoner, waiting to cross an ocean to an enemy country he couldn't imagine. The ship departed from Oran on June 15th. It was a converted Liberty ship, its holds modified to transport prisoners rather than cargo. 300 German prisoners crowded below deck in compartments designed for half that number. The air grew thick and foul within hours' sweat, vomit, unwashed bodies, fear. Men who had survived combat succumbed to seasickness, lying in their own mess while the ship pitched through Atlantic swells. Klaus found a spot near a ventilation grate and stayed there. He rationed his breathing, taking shallow draws of slightly fresher air, while around him groaned and prayed and argued in low voices. The American guards appeared twice daily, with food, hard bread, tinned meat, water in metal cups. They weren't cruel, but they weren't kind either. Just efficient, professional, treating the prisoners as cargo to be delivered intact. The crossing took 11 days. 11 days of darkness interrupted by dim electric lights. 11 days of the ship's constant motion, the groan of metal, the slosh of bilge water below. 11 days of men slowly losing hope, their conversations growing quieter, their eyes growing distant. Some still clung to the old certainties. Germany would win. This was temporary. America would collapse any day now. Others had stopped believing anything at all. On the morning of June 26th, everything changed. Klaus woke to unusual sounds, shouting, movement, a change in engine rhythm that suggested the ship was slowing. Word passed through the hold like electricity. Land. America. They were arriving. Men who had barely moved in days suddenly found energy, pushing toward the ladders, craning for any glimpse of what lay ahead. The guards allowed them on deck in groups. Klaus emerged into morning light that felt impossibly bright after 11 days below. He squinted, waiting for his eyes to adjust, and then he saw it. The harbor. It stretched before him, vast and busy and utterly undamaged. Ships moved everywhere, merchant vessels, naval craft, smaller boats threading between them like insects. Cranes lined the docks, loading and unloading cargo with mechanical precision. Warehouses stood intact, their roofs unmarked by bombs. And beyond, rising against the sky, the city itself. New York. Klaus had seen photographs of cities. Berlin, Frankfurt, Hamburg, all familiar, all European in scale and design. This was something else entirely. Buildings rose impossibly tall, their glass windows catching the morning sun and throwing it back in blinding fragments. The skyline seemed to climb forever, each structure competing with the next for height and grandeur. No bomb damage, no burned-out shells, no rubble-filled streets or collapsed facades. Someone behind him whispered in German, "This cannot be real." But it was real, undeniably real, and the realization moved through the prisoners like a physical force. They had been told America was weak, struggling, on the brink of collapse. Instead, they were looking at evidence of wealth and industry beyond anything they had imagined. The harbor alone handled more traffic than any German port. The buildings alone suggested resources that dwarfed European cities. Klaus felt something crack inside his chest. Not dramatic, not sudden, but a slow fracture in the foundation of everything he had believed. If they had lied about this, and clearly they had, what else was a lie? The whispered conversations around him suggested other prisoners were experiencing the same revelation. Men stared in silence, their faces showing confusion, anger, dawning comprehension. An American officer appeared on the deck, speaking through a translator. "You will be processed at Camp Shanks in New York State," the translator said. "From there, you will be transferred to permanent camps in various locations. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will be fed, clothed, housed, and given work details appropriate to your rank. Any prisoner attempting escape will be shot. Any prisoner causing disruption will be disciplined. Otherwise, you will find your captivity ... bearable." The word bearable caused bitter laughter among some prisoners. They were still processing what they had seen. The harbor continued its busy operation around them, indifferent to their presence. The city rose behind it, testament to industrial capacity they had been told didn't exist. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical. Their training insisted this wasn't possible, but their eyes provided irrefutable evidence. The ship docked at a military facility. Guards organized the prisoners into groups of 50, moving them down gangplanks onto American soil for the first time. Klaus walked carefully, his legs uncertain, after 11 days at sea, his mind still struggling with what he had witnessed. Around him, other prisoners looked equally disoriented, not from seasickness, but from the collision of expectation and reality. Processing took hours. They stood in lines that moved with bureaucratic slowness through a series of stations. First, their names recorded in thick ledgers, their ranks verified against German military records somehow acquired by American intelligence. And medical examinations cursory, but thorough enough to identify anyone requiring immediate treatment. Then delousing, showers with harsh soap, clean uniforms to replace the salt-crusted remnants they had worn since Africa. Klaus stood under hot water for the first time in months. He watched dirt and sand and old sweat circle the drain, felt muscles relax that had been tensed since capture. The simple luxury of it, abundant hot water, clean soap, time enough to actually get clean, struck him as almost obscene. They were prisoners. They had lost the war, or at least their part in it. Yet here they stood, treated better than they had been by their own army in the desert. The new uniforms were American-made, but marked clearly, PW in large letters. Prisoner of war. The designation was painted on the back of shirts, stenciled onto trousers. They were given boots, not new, but serviceable, and thin jackets against weather they couldn't yet imagine. Klaus dressed slowly, noting the quality of the fabric, the functionality of the design. Even the prisoner uniforms were better than what the regime had provided many units by 1943. From Camp Shanks, they were loaded onto trains. Not cattle cars, as they had been moved in North Africa. Not even simple freight cars. Actual passenger cars, with seats and windows and ventilation. American guards rode in separate compartments, armed but not oppressive. The prisoners sat in stunned silence as the train pulled out of New York, watching America pass by outside the windows. Klaus pressed his face to the glass and tried to understand what he was seeing. Farms, first neat fields, painted barns, livestock that looked healthy and abundant. Then small towns, their main streets lined with shops that appeared to be open and functioning. Cars moved on the roads, civilian vehicles in numbers that would have been impossible in wartime Germany. People walked on sidewalks, apparently unconcerned about air raids or shortages, or any of the privations that dominated European civilian life. The train stopped in a small Pennsylvania town for water. Local residents had gathered at the station, curious about the prisoners. Klaus expected hostility, angry faces, shouted threats, perhaps thrown stones. Instead, he saw mostly curiosity. Children stared wide-eyed. Women whispered to each other. A few men nodded grimly, but without obvious malice. One elderly woman even waved, just a small gesture that she quickly suppressed, as if embarrassed by the impulse. Hans Müller, sitting beside Klaus, shook his head slowly. "They told us Americans would tear us apart," he said quietly. "They told us American cities were starving. American industry was broken. American spirit was defeated." He gestured toward the window. "Does any of this look defeated to you?" Klaus had no answer. The train continued through Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then Indiana. The landscape varied hills, then flat farmland, then small cities, but the pattern remained consistent. Abundance, industry, civilians, living apparently normal lives while their nation fought a war on multiple continents. The disconnect was almost impossible to process. By evening of the second day, they reached their destination, Camp Perry, Ohio. The camp sat on Lake Erie's shore, sprawling across acres of flatland. Barracks stood in neat rows, surrounded by chain-link fence and guard towers. It looked military, efficient, but nothing like the brutal camps Klaus had imagined. No machine gun nests every 50 meters. No barbed wire strung at throat height. Just functional security for a facility housing enemy prisoners. The camp commander addressed them through a translator. "You are prisoners of war," he said. "You will be treated according to international law. You will receive adequate food, adequate shelter, adequate medical care. You will be given work assignments, farming, construction, forestry. You will be paid for your labor in camp script that can be used at the canteen. You will be allowed to write letters home, subject to censorship. You will be allowed to receive packages, also subject to inspection. Escape attempts will result in severe punishment. Cooperation will result in fair treatment. We didn't start this war, but we'll end it properly." The speech was translated in sections, giving prisoners time to absorb each point. Klaus listened to the murmurs around him. Some prisoners remained defiant, muttering about the regime's inevitable victory. Others seemed cautiously relieved. A few appeared broken, their faces showing the hollow exhaustion of men who had simply stopped caring about anything beyond basic survival. They were assigned to barracks that evening. Klaus found himself in Barracks 7 with 49 other prisoners, mostly former Afrika Korps like himself. The building was simple wooden walls, a tin roof, rows of metal bunks with thin mattresses. Not comfortable, but far better than the desert or the ship's hold. Each bunk had a footlocker. Each prisoner received 2 blankets, a pillow, basic toiletries. That night, lying on a mattress that didn't move with ocean swells, Klaus tried to process everything he had seen. The harbor, the skyline, the farms and towns and civilian abundance. The camp itself, which felt more like a military base than a punishment facility. Every detail contradicted what he had been told about America. Either the regime's propaganda had been entirely false, or somehow Germany had been fighting a war it could never win. The thought was too large to hold completely. He pushed it away, focused on immediate concerns. Food tomorrow, work assignments, letters home. Would they allow that? Could he tell his family where he was, that he was alive and safe? Would his letters reach Wurzburg? Or had American bombs destroyed his hometown like German bombs had destroyed English cities? Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by men coughing, shifting, muttering in dreams. The next morning began with breakfast. The prisoners were marched to the mess hall, a large building capable of seating 300. Klaus expected watery soup and hard-bread standard prison fare. Instead, he received a metal tray loaded with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, coffee with sugar, and cream available. The portions were generous. The quality was good. He sat at a long table and stared at the food. Around him, other prisoners were having the same experience. Some ate mechanically, not trusting the food to continue. Others ate slowly, savoring flavors they hadn't tasted in months. A few couldn't eat at all, their stomachs too accustomed to deprivation to handle sudden abundance. Klaus picked up a piece of bacon and bit carefully. The fat and salt exploded across his tongue, and something inside him broke. Not dramatically, but completely. He sat there, chewing bacon in an American prison camp, and understood with sudden clarity that everything he had believed was a lie. Germany wasn't winning. Germany couldn't win. The resources he was seeing, the industrial capacity implied by every detail, the simple fact that America could feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. Hans sat down beside him with a tray equally full. "They're not starving," Hans said quietly. "We're the ones who were starving." Klaus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. After breakfast, they were given work assignments. Klaus and 20 others were assigned to a nearby farm, leased by the army to provide fresh produce for the camp. They would work 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, supervised by American guards and the farm's owner. They would be paid 50 cents per day in camp scrip, not much, but enough to purchase small luxuries from the canteen. The farm lay 3 miles from camp, reached by truck. They drove through Ohio countryside that looked nothing like the battlefields Klaus had known. Everything was peaceful, orderly, abundant. Farms stretched across the landscape in neat squares. Livestock grazed in green pastures. The sky was cloudless and blue, unmarked by contrails or smoke. The farmer who owned the property was named Robert Harrison. He was 63, too old for military service, his son overseas fighting in Europe. He regarded the German prisoners with wary neutrality, not hostile, but not friendly. "You'll work the corn today," he told them through a translator. "You'll do what I tell you, when I tell you, how I tell you. No laziness, no sabotage. You work fair, you'll be treated fair." They worked. The labor was hard, but familiar to Klaus, who who had grown up on a farm. Hoeing weeds between corn rows, the sun climbing higher and hotter as morning progressed. His muscles, weakened by months of poor food and inactivity, protested at every movement. But the work felt almost therapeutic, simple, purposeful, disconnected from war and violence and propaganda. At noon, Harrison brought lunch. Sandwiches, thick bread with ham and cheese, apples, cookies, lemonade in glass jars that sweated in the heat. He handed them out to the prisoners with no ceremony, just practical acknowledgement that workers needed food. "You got 15 minutes," he said. Then back to the corn. Klaus sat in the shade of a barn and ate his sandwich slowly. The ham was thick, the cheese was real, the bread was fresh. He tried to remember the last time he had eaten this well. Before the war? Before Africa, certainly. Maybe not since 1939, when rationing had begun and quality had slowly declined into quantity alone. A younger prisoner named Werner sat nearby, staring at his sandwich with visible confusion. "I don't understand," Werner said softly. "Why do they feed us like this? We're enemies. We were trying to conquer them just months ago. Why would they waste good food on prisoners?" Hans, sitting against the barn wall, answered without opening his eyes. "Because they have enough to waste. Because they so rich, they can afford to feed their enemies better than we fed our own soldiers. Because we were fighting a country we never had a chance of beating." The words hung in the afternoon heat, undeniable and bitter. Work resumed, continued until evening. By the time they loaded back onto trucks, Klaus was exhausted, but also oddly satisfied. The labor had been honest. The treatment had been fair. No beatings, no curses, no deliberate cruelty. Just work, food, and return to camp. That evening, they were allowed to write letters. Each prisoner received paper, envelope, and pencil. They could write 1 letter per week, maximum 2 pages, subject to censorship. Anything about camp locations, military information, or critical of their captivity would be removed. Otherwise, they were free to communicate with family. Klaus sat at a rough wooden table in the barracks and tried to find words. "Dear mother and father," he began. "I am alive and safe in America. I was captured in Africa and transported here. I am being treated well. The food is good. The work is fair. Please do not worry about me." He wanted to write more about the harbor, the skyline, the farms, the cognitive dissonance of being treated decently by enemies. But how could he explain something he barely understood himself? How could he tell his family that everything they had been told was a lie without suggesting disloyalty? How could he describe America's abundance without implying Germany's poverty? In the end, he kept it simple. "I miss you all terribly," he continued. "I think of home every day. I hope the farm is well and that you are all safe. Please give my love to Maria. Tell her I will return when this war ends. Until then, know that I am alive and that I remember you always. Your son, Klaus." He sealed the letter and handed it to the guard for inspection. The routine established itself over the following weeks. Wake at dawn. Breakfast in the mess hall, always abundant, always good. Work assignments, the farm for Klaus and his group. Lunch provided by Harrison, who gradually grew less wary as prisoners proved reliable. Return to camp by evening. Dinner. Free time to read. Write letters, play cards. Lights out at 10. It was, Klaus realized with strange discomfort, more structured and secure than his life had been in the German army. The cognitive dissonance never fully resolved, just became familiar. He was a prisoner, but ate better than he had as a soldier. He was an enemy, but was treated more humanely than many German civilians. He had lost the war, but found safety in defeat. The contradictions stacked up daily, wearing away at the foundation of everything the regime had taught. Other prisoners experienced similar revelations at different speeds. Some remained hardcore believers, insisting this was temporary, that Germany would rally and win. These men formed their own groups, met in corners of barracks, whispered about maintaining discipline and preparing for eventual liberation. The American guards watched them carefully, but allowed the gatherings as long as they didn't become disruptive. Others, like Klaus, simply stopped believing. Not dramatically, but gradually, like faith leaking away through 1,000 small cracks. Each good meal was a crack. Each fair work assignment was a crack. Each letter from home that reported worsening conditions in Germany, while conditions in the camp remained stable, was a crack. Eventually, the whole structure of belief collapsed, leaving only facts. The facts were undeniable. America had resources Germany couldn't match. America had industry Germany couldn't compete with. America had political stability and civilian morale that Germany had sacrificed for military expansion. The regime had gambled everything on quick victory and overwhelming force, and when that failed, they had nothing left but propaganda and increasingly desperate lies. By August, even the hardcore believers were quieter. News filtered into the camp through guards, through American newspapers allowed in limited quantities, through Red Cross officials who visited periodically. Sicily invaded, Italy wavering. German cities bombed heavily. The Eastern Front grinding through impossible casualties. Every bulletin confirmed what Klaus had suspected since seeing New York Harbor. Germany was losing, and nothing could change that. Harrison, the farmer, gradually became less distant. Not friendly, exactly, but human. He learned a few German words. He stopped watching the prisoners quite so carefully. Once, when Klaus successfully repaired a broken irrigation pump, Harrison nodded approval and said, "Good work." Just 2 words, but carrying weight beyond their brevity. In September, Harrison brought his wife to the farm. She was 60, small and quiet, carrying baskets of fresh-baked bread. She distributed slices to the prisoners, not speaking, just handing out food with efficient kindness. Klaus accepted his portion and thanked her in broken English. "Thank you, Mom." "Very good." She studied his face for a moment, seeing something there that made her expression soften. "You have family?" She asked through the translator. "Yes, ma'am. Mother, father, sister." "In Germany?" She nodded slowly. "Our son is in Germany now, fighting." She didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The parallel was clear. Her son there, Klaus here, both far from home, both caught in machinery beyond their control. "I hope he is safe," Klaus said quietly. "I hope your family is safe too," she replied. Then she moved on, distributing bread to other prisoners, leaving Klaus with the uncomfortable realization that his enemies were not monsters, but simply people from a different place. October brought colder weather. The camp distributed warmer clothing jackets, heavier pants, wool caps. The prisoners adapted their routines. Work on the farm became less available as harvest ended and winter preparation began. Some prisoners were assigned to forestry work, others to camp maintenance, others to small manufacturing tasks that didn't violate Geneva Convention prohibitions. Klaus was assigned to the camp canteen. He worked 6 hours daily, stocking shelves, managing inventory, assisting prisoners who came to purchase small items with their accumulated scrip. The canteen sold toiletries, cigarettes, candy, playing cards, writing materials. Nothing luxury, but small comforts that made captivity more bearable. The work brought Klaus into contact with prisoners from other barracks. He heard their stories, their varying experiences, their different rates of disillusionment. Some remained bitter and defiant. Others had adapted pragmatically. A few had become almost comfortable, recognizing that imprisonment in America was safer than combat anywhere else. One prisoner, a former officer named Dieter Schmidt, came to the canteen regularly. He was 45, educated, formerly a teacher before conscription. He purchased cigarettes and newspaper subscriptions, reading everything available about the war's progress. One evening, he lingered at the counter after other customers had left. "You've seen it too," he said quietly to Klaus. "How impossible this all is." Klaus glanced at the guard standing near the door, then nodded carefully. Dieter continued, "I spent 2 years fighting in Poland, France, then Africa. I believed what we were told, that we were superior, that victory was inevitable, that our enemies were weak and decadent." He gestured around the canteen, encompassing the whole camp. "This is not weakness. This is not decadence. This is—" He trailed off, searching for words. "This is what a country looks like when it doesn't spend everything on war, when it values its people more than conquest." Klaus said nothing, letting Dieter work through his thoughts. "We lost this war before it started," Dieter said finally. "Not militarily, we had early success. But fundamentally, we lost because we were fighting countries with more resources, more industry, more population, and more importantly, something worth fighting for beyond expansion. They're fighting to defend homes. We're fighting to take them." The guard coughed meaningfully, suggesting the conversation was approaching forbidden territory. Dieter nodded, paid for his cigarettes, and left. But his words stayed with Klaus, crystallizing thoughts he had been circling for months. Winter settled over Ohio, with cold that cut through clothing. The prisoners received additional blankets, fuel for barrack stoves, warmer meals designed to provide calories for heat. Klaus worked in the canteen and watched snowfall past the windows, thinking about Germany, about his family, about what waited after the war. Letters from home had become irregular and often arrived heavily censored. His mother's handwriting appeared in late November with news that had been blacked out in multiple places. Klaus could only infer from what remained. The farm was struggling. Food was rationed severely. Air raids were frequent. She didn't complain directly, but the subtext was clear. Life in Germany had become difficult in ways that made his captivity seem almost privileged. The contradiction sat heavy in his chest. He was a prisoner in enemy hands, yet he ate better, slept safer, and lived more comfortably than civilians at home. The regime had promised victory and delivered only suffering. The enemy had promised justice and, at least in this small corner of war, actually delivered it. Christmas 1943 arrived with unexpected ceremony. The camp administration organized a Christmas program decorations in the mess hall, special food, permission for prisoners to hold religious services. A Protestant chaplain came from a nearby town to lead German language worship. The Red Cross delivered packages with candy, cigarettes, small personal items. Klaus attended the service and listened to familiar hymns sung in his native language. The words felt strange in his mouth now, weighted with new understanding. Silent Night, Holy Night once, just a Christmas song, now laden with irony. There was no silence, no holiness, just war grinding through its 4th year while prisoners sang in a camp 6,000 miles from home. After the service, the mess hall served a holiday meal. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pie for dessert. The abundance felt almost obscene. Klaus ate slowly, watching other prisoners react to the meal. Some seemed grateful. Others appeared uncomfortable, perhaps thinking of hungry families back home. A few refused to eat entirely, considering acceptance of the meal a betrayal of some kind. Klaus ate because refusing seemed pointless and because hunger was honest. That evening, lying in his bunk while snow whispered against the windows, he thought about the path that had led him here. From his father's farm to military training to Poland to France to Africa to this moment, lying warm and fed in an enemy prison camp while his country burned. The propaganda had promised glory. The reality had delivered only this survival through defeat, safety through surrender, the slow dissolution of certainty into complicated truth. He was alive when so many weren't. He was safe when his family wasn't. He had learned that enemies could be decent, and that his own side could lie with breathtaking completeness. The knowledge changed nothing and everything simultaneously. 1944 arrived with deep cold and deeper news. The war ground on, Allied bombing of Germany intensified. The Eastern Front continued its bloody stalemate. Italy had indeed switched sides. Rumors of invasion planning spread through the camp, whispered among prisoners who still followed the war's progress. Klaus worked, wrote letters, read what news was available, and waited. The waiting became its own strange existence. Not comfortable, but stable. Not free, but safer than freedom had been in uniform. Each day was like the previous work, meals, evening routine, sleep. The monotony was almost soothing after years of violence and chaos. In March, Harrison appeared at the camp requesting specific prisoners for spring planting. Klaus was among those selected, returning to the farm he had worked the previous year. The fields were still frozen, but preparation work began: equipment maintenance, barn repairs, fence mending. Harrison treated the prisoners with familiar efficiency, no longer wary, but not exactly friendly either. Just practical acceptance of useful labor. One afternoon, Harrison asked Klaus directly, "You know anything about tractors?" Klaus nodded. "My father has one. Had one. I worked on it many times." Harrison led him to a shed where an old tractor sat with a broken transmission. "Fix that, and I'll make sure you get extra scrip," Harrison said. "Parts are there. Tools are there. Don't hurt yourself or break anything else." Klaus worked on the tractor for 3 days. It was like being home, hands greasy with oil, mind focused on mechanical problems instead of existential ones. The transmission had 3 stripped gears that needed replacement. Klaus fabricated what he couldn't find, adapted parts that were close enough, and eventually got the tractor running again. Harrison tested it, driving in circles around the yard, gears shifting smoothly. When he returned, he looked at Klaus with something approaching respect. "That's good work. Real good work." He handed Klaus an extra $1 in scrip. "You keep doing work like that, we'll get along just fine." It was a small moment, but felt significant. Klaus had proven himself valuable, demonstrated skill, earned something like approval from an enemy. The strange new world continued taking shape around him, defined by practical competence rather than national allegiance. By summer 1944, news of the invasion reached the camp. Allied forces had landed in France. The Western Front was reopening. Germany now fought on 3 fronts: west, south, east, with resources stretched impossibly thin. Even hardcore believers in the camp fell quiet, unable to deny the obvious trajectory. Klaus received a letter from his mother in July. It had taken 4 months to arrive and was heavily censored, but enough remained to paint the picture. The farm was abandoned. Labor shortages made it impossible to work properly. They had moved into town, living in an apartment with his aunt's family. Food was scarce. Air raids came frequently. His sister had been conscripted for war work in a munitions factory. Wurzburg was damaged, but still standing. "Please come home soon," his mother wrote at the end. "We need you here. We miss you terribly. Please come home safe when this terrible war finally ends." Klaus read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his footlocker. Going home. The concept felt abstract now. Home to what? A defeated country? Occupation? Economic collapse? The future was impossible to imagine, too vast and uncertain to grasp. He could only focus on the present work: food, letters, the strange stability of captivity. The months passed. Summer heat gave way to autumn cool. Harvest time brought long days in the fields, bringing in corn and soybeans. Harrison's son returned from Europe, wounded but alive, and visited the farm once. He looked at the German prisoners with complicated expression. They were enemies, but they had kept his father's farm running while he was gone. Winter returned, the cycle completing. Klaus worked in the canteen again, watching new prisoners arrive from the European theater. They brought news of the war's final stage, Germany retreating on all fronts, cities destroyed, infrastructure collapsing. The regime's propaganda had stopped even pretending victory was possible. Now they spoke only of fighting to the last, taking as many enemies as possible before the end. Klaus listened to these new prisoners and saw his own journey reflected. They arrived with the same expectations he had held Americans as savages. America as weakling, imminent rescue by victorious German forces. Then the same sequence of revelations, the harbor, the abundance, the fair treatment, the cognitive dissonance, the slow acceptance of uncomfortable truth. Some learned faster than others, but almost all learned eventually. In December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge news reached the camp. A final German offensive in Belgium, initially successful, ultimately doomed. The hardcore prisoners briefly revived their hopes. Perhaps this was the turning point. Perhaps victory was still possible. But within weeks, those hopes collapsed again as news came of the offensive's failure and the beginning of Germany Hess's final retreat. Klaus felt nothing but sadness. Sadness for the soldiers dying in Belgium for nothing. Sadness for German cities burning. Sadness for his family enduring conditions he could barely imagine. Sadness for the entire waste of it, the years, the lives, the destruction, all for a cause that had been doomed from the start. Spring 1945 arrived with rumors of the end. The Rhine crossed, German cities falling, the eastern and western fronts squeezing Germany like a vice. Prisoners clustered around radios when news broadcasts were allowed, listening to their country's death rattle described in clinical English. On May 8, 1945, the announcement came: Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The camp reacted with strange silence. No celebration from the prisoners. How could they celebrate defeat? But also no visible grief. Just quiet acceptance of the inevitable, mixed with relief that the killing would finally stop. Klaus stood in the barracks that evening and tried to feel something definitive. Victory would have felt better than defeat, obviously. But defeat felt better than continued war. The war was over. His family had survived. His mother's last letter from March confirmed they were alive. He was alive. Millions weren't, but he was, and that counted for something. The question now was, what came next? The answer took months to emerge. Prisoners would remain in American camps until repatriation could be organized. Germany was occupied, divided, undergoing denazification. Returning prisoners would face screening, questioning, verification. Some, particularly former officers and political operatives, would face longer detention. Others would be released to begin rebuilding. Klaus worked and waited. The canteen continued operating. Life in camp remained stable. Letters from home came more regularly now that mail services were being restored. His mother wrote about conditions in occupied Germany, food still scarce, housing damaged, but violence ended and some services returning. His sister had returned from factory work. They had reclaimed the farm and were trying to plant, though equipment was scarce and labor shortage remained critical. "We need you home," his mother wrote again. "Please come as soon as they allow." The screening began in July 1945. Each prisoner underwent extensive interviews. Political affiliation, military service details, involvement in specific operations, knowledge of particular activities. The Americans were thorough, using captured German records to verify claims and catch lies. Klaus's interview lasted 4 hours. He answered honestly conscripted in 1941, infantry training, service in Poland, France, then Africa. No party membership beyond Hitler Youth as a teenager, which had been mandatory. No participation in activities beyond normal combat operations. No knowledge of anything except basic military service. The interrogator, a captain named Morris, studied him carefully. "You seem to have adapted well to captivity," Morris observed. Klaus considered his answer. "I adapted to reality. I was taught things that proved untrue. Coming here showed me the truth. That's all." Morris made notes. Do you intend to return to Germany? It's my home. My family is there. And politically? What will you do in occupied Germany? Farm, Klaus said simply. Rebuild my father's farm. Help my family. Live quietly. I've seen enough politics and war for one lifetime. Morris nodded slowly, made more notes, then closed the file. You'll be cleared for repatriation, probably within 6 months. Continue current routine until notified. 6 months became 8. Klaus continued working, writing, waiting. Other prisoners left in groups, loaded onto trains bound for ships bound for Europe. The camp's population slowly declined. Barracks emptied. The routines continued with fewer participants. In February 1946, Klaus's name appeared on a repatriation list. He had 10 days to prepare, receive final pay, collect belongings, write final letters. Harrison came to the camp to say goodbye, bringing a letter of reference stating Klaus was a good worker, honest and skilled. It might help with occupation authorities, Harrison said. Might help you get started again. Klaus thanked him, shook his hand, and felt the strange weight of gratitude toward an enemy. The journey home reversed the journey to America. Trained to New York, processed at Camp Shanks again, loaded onto a transport ship. Klaus stood on deck as the ship left harbor, watching the skyline recede. The same skyline that had shattered his certainties nearly 3 years earlier. It looked the same tall, undamaged, prosperous, testament to resources and industry that had won the war before the first shot was fired. The Atlantic crossing took 12 days. Klaus spent much of it on deck when weather allowed, watching the empty horizon and thinking about what came next. Germany would be different occupied, damaged, transformed. His life would be different. No more war, but also no more youth or innocence or simple certainties. He was 23 years old and felt ancient. The ship docked at Bremen in March 1946. Klaus disembarked into a Germany he barely recognized. The port was functional, but showed everywhere the marks of bombing. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their windows empty, their walls scorched. Debris had been cleared from streets or remained piled in vacant lots. People moved through the ruins with faces that showed exhaustion and grim determination. This was the Germany he had fought to defend. This was what his sacrifice and suffering had purchased: defeat, occupation, destruction, the need to rebuild from rubble. He carried his small bag and Harrison's letter of reference and walked into the ruins with no certainty, except that he would survive, because surviving was what he had learned to do. The train to Wurzburg took 2 days. Routes were still damaged, requiring detours through functional track. Klaus rode with other returning prisoners, all silent, all processing their first sight of home in years. The countryside showed war's passage and destroyed bridges, burned villages, abandoned military equipment slowly rusting in fields. Wurzburg appeared different than Klaus remembered. The town center was heavily damaged medieval buildings reduced to rubble, churches roofless, familiar streets unrecognizable. But his family's farm, on the outskirts, had survived relatively intact. The barn was damaged, fields overgrown, equipment broken, but the house still stood. His mother opened the door and saw him. For a moment, she just stared, as if unable to believe he was real. Then she pulled him inside with strength he didn't know she possessed, hugging him so tightly he could barely breathe, crying into his shoulder with sounds that contained 3 years of worry and relief and joy. His father appeared, older and thinner, walking with a limp Klaus didn't remember. His sister was taller now, 17 instead of 14, her face showing the transformation from child to adult that war had accelerated for everyone. They sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen Klaus had remembered during long nights in camp, and talked until dawn. Klaus told them about Africa, about capture, about the journey to America. He told them about the harbor and the skyline, and the cognitive dissonance of being treated fairly by enemies. He told them about the farm in Ohio, about Harrison and his family, about learning that propaganda was just propaganda and truth was complicated. His parents listened with expressions that showed they understood, that they too had learned difficult lessons about reality versus promises. The months that followed were hard. Rebuilding the farm from near nothing, working with broken equipment and scarce resources, navigating occupation bureaucracy, proving they weren't hardcore supporters of the regime, obtaining permits and rations, and the countless permissions required for simple daily life. Learning to live in defeated Germany, which meant accepting occupation, accepting blame, accepting transformation. But Klaus had learned adaptation in an American prison camp. He worked systematically, using Harrison's letter of reference to prove competence to British occupation authorities. He repaired equipment with skills learned fixing Harrison's tractor. He maintained the same routine that had sustained him in Ohio work, meals, evening quiet, sleep. Slowly, season by season, the farm recovered. In 1948, Klaus married a girl from town whose family farm had also survived. They worked side by side, combining resources and labor. Children came, 3 eventually, born into a Germany transformed by defeat into something new. Klaus told them stories about the war, about America, about what he had learned when expectation met reality. In 1952, Klaus received a letter from Ohio. Harrison wrote that his son had fully recovered, that the farm was prosperous, that he remembered Klaus and the other prisoners who had helped keep it running. He enclosed photographs, the farm, the barn, the tractor Klaus had repaired, which still ran fine. He asked how Klaus was doing, whether the farm in Germany had recovered, whether life was returning to normal. Klaus wrote back. The correspondence continued sporadically for years. 2 farmers on opposite sides of a war that had ended, maintaining connection because war's end didn't erase shared experience. They exchanged photographs of families, updates on crops, observations about weather and politics, and the slow work of recovery. In 1960, Klaus's oldest son asked why his father stayed in touch with an American. Klaus thought about the question, about how to explain complicated truth to a child. Because during the war, he said finally, I learned that enemies are just people from somewhere else. I learned that the ones telling us who to hate were lying. I learned that ordinary life farming, family, work matters more than flags or nations or any of the things we're told to fight for. Mr. Harrison taught me that, even though he didn't know he was teaching it. So I stay in touch to remember. The son accepted this, moved on to other questions, other concerns. Klaus returned to his work, to the ordinary miracle of living in peace. The years passed quietly. The farm prospered. Germany transformed from occupation to sovereignty to prosperity. The war receded into history, becoming story, becoming memory, becoming lesson for new generations who would hopefully learn without repeating. Klaus Becker died in 1989, age 66, of heart failure. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his war service, his capture, his time as a prisoner in America. It mentioned the farm he had rebuilt, the family he had raised, the quiet life he had lived. It didn't mention the cognitive dissonance of seeing New York Harbor, the slow dissolution of propaganda into truth, the complicated gratitude toward enemies who had treated him decently. But his children knew these stories. They preserved his letters from America, Harrison's photographs, the strange artifacts of a time when their father had learned that the world was more complicated than he'd been taught. They told their own children about the farm in Ohio, about the tractor repair, about the lesson that enemies are just people, and that ordinary decency transcends national hatred. The lesson didn't end the world's wars or hatred, but it persisted, small and stubborn, in the lives of people who had learned it personally. Klaus had expected savages and found farmers. He had expected cruelty and found fairness. He had expected a collapsing nation and found abundance. The expectations were lies. The reality was complicated. The truth was that ordinary people on both sides just wanted to survive, to work, to live. That truth, learned in a prison camp in Ohio, sustained Klaus Becker through 43 years of post-war life. It was enough.